welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a journey way back in time, all the way to the 1st century AD.
That's right, roughly the years 1 to 100.
Yeah, it's a century that, sometimes gets a bit overshadowed by the really big names like Augustus maybe, or the later Roman emperors, or it feels sort of tucked between phases of the Han Dynasty in China.
But looking at the sources you've pulled together for us, it was absolutely foundational. It really was. And our mission for this deep dive, it isn't just to look at one place, right?
No,
We're exploring 3 major global powers that were all around at the same time. The Roman Empire, obviously, the Han Dynasty in China, and then this really dynamic landscape of kingdoms and empires emerging across India.
We've got this stack of articles, research notes, and the idea is to pull out the most important facts, maybe some surprising insights from all of them for you.
That's the goal. Whether you're, prepping for something specific on ancient history or maybe you're just curious, we want to give you that shortcut to being pretty well informed.
We'll get into the details,
Right.
definitely. Use the precise terms from the sources where it matters. But, crucially, we also wanted to explain the core concepts in a way that, well, that sticks. Maybe even simple enough for a 5-year-old at heart.
Huh. Yeah, think of this as your, comprehensive audio overview of what was really going on in this key century across the known world at the time.
Right. We'll cover, well, everything from intense political drama, military stuff,
To amazing inventions, massive trade networks connecting these places.
and even some major natural disasters that really changed things.
Okay, let's dive in. This incredible century. And I guess where better to start than Rome?
Makes sense. Coming off that long reign of Augustus, they've got this huge empire, but right away, they face this massive challenge. Who rules next?
Oh, yeah. This problem of imperial succession, it's a thread that just runs right through the early part of this century, especially with the Julio-Claudian dynasty.
Right.
Augustus dies in 14 AD, and his adopted son Tiberius takes over. He'd actually been granted equal power the year before, in 13 AD, so it's sort of planned.
Sort of. But after Tiberius, things get messy.
Very messy. Caligula's reign, pretty short, ends in assassination. Then Claudius, well, the sources lean towards him being poisoned.
Which brings Nero to power. Infamous Nero.
Of course. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, the first big state-sponsored persecution of Christians, follows that. His rule also ends violently. He takes his own life in 68 AD after the Senate declares him a public enemy.
That rapid, violent turnover. It really shows how fragile things were at the very top, doesn't it?
Absolutely. There wasn't a clear rule book for succession, and the emperor's death was like this trigger for potential chaos. We saw it explode in the Year of the Four Emperors, 68 to 69 AD.
Right. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian, all fighting for control in, about 18 months? Rome's first big civil war since the Republic fell.
Exactly. Galba, murdered by the Praetorian Guard, with Otho involved. Otho then loses a battle, commits suicide. Vitellius has a brief, bloody turn before the general Vespasian marches on Rome and wins out.
Vespasian establishes the Flavian dynasty, which was more stable, thankfully.
It was. It showed the empire was strong enough underneath to survive that kind of turmoil. But wow, it also showed that leadership succession was this massive systemic vulnerability.
So if you're trying to get the core concept here.
Okay, think of it like this. Imagine a super powerful company, right? But when the CEO retires or dies, the rules for who takes over next are totally unclear, completely up for grabs.
Okay.
So everyone with any influence, the generals, the guards, powerful families, they all start fighting, sometimes literally fighting until someone strong enough grabs the reins. And maybe they write a new temporary rule book.
That makes the chaos very clear. Okay, so Rome wasn't just looking inward, dealing with all this drama. They were still expanding outwards.
Oh, definitely. Military expansion kept going, though it wasn't always smooth sailing. Claudius launched the big invasion of Britain in 43 AD.
Right, with Aulus Claudius.
Yeah, sending him with maybe 40,000 men. They set up bases, including one that eventually becomes London, or Londinium, as they called it.
But consolidating control wasn't quick.
No, the sources say it was this painstaking, 40-year effort just to really settle South Britain.
And Roman expansion often came with, well, pretty intense brutality, didn't it?
Sadly, yes. There are dark examples. The actions of General Suetonius Paulinus in 59 AD massacring Celts and Druids at Anglesey. Just brutal.
And that harshness often fueled resistance.
Fierce resistance. Queen Boudicca's revolt in 61 AD was a powerful response to Roman actions. Her forces actually burned Londinium to the ground. In the end, she was defeated and chose poison over capture.
So while they were pushing out, they also hit some serious limits, even major defeats.
The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, that's a really stark reminder. 3 entire Roman legions ambushed and just wiped out by Germanic warriors.
It wasn't just a battle loss.
No, it was way more than that. It effectively marked the Rhine River as a long-term frontier, sort of a boundary between the Latin-speaking Roman world and the Germanic world. Later in the century, they also worked on solidifying boundaries south of the Danube with fortifications, the limes.
And they had trouble elsewhere, too.
Yeah, challenges in places like Dacia. A general named Cornelius Fuscus was defeated there in 86 AD, though another general, Tedius Iulianus, managed a victory a couple of years later in 88.
And one of the most significant conflicts of the century was the Jewish Revolt.
Incredibly significant, yes. A really drawn-out, brutal war from 66 to 73 AD.
What kicked it off?
Well, it was partly Roman provocations, things like looting the temple treasury in Jerusalem. Jewish rebels initially kicked the Romans out of the city.
But Rome responded forcefully.
Massively. They sent Vespasian before he was emperor and later his son Titus to crush the revolt. It ended with the devastating siege and fall of Jerusalem and the burning of the Second Temple in 70 AD.
Which was just catastrophic for the Jewish people.
Absolutely. It essentially destroyed the Jewish state, led to mass death, enslavement, and deepened the diaspora. The last stand at the fortress of Masada fell in 73 AD. A profound religious and cultural trauma.
Okay, so for a core concept on the military side.
You could think of the Roman army as this incredibly powerful force, right? Like a super strong hand trying to grip territories far away, places like Britain. But sometimes that hand met really stiff resistance, like Boudicca's Britons or the Jewish rebels. And sometimes it got severely bitten and had to pull back, like at Teutoburg Forest. It shows their power wasn't absolute everywhere.
That captures it well. Okay, shifting focus a bit.
Yeah.
Daily life and society in Rome itself. Sounds like a mix of routine and, well, stark inequality.
Very much so. Sources paint a picture of a typical day, maybe starting with a light breakfast, then work until early afternoon.
And the public baths were huge, right? Not just for getting clean.
No, they were major social hubs. Then dinner, often around 3 p.m., was the main meal, a big social event for those who could afford it.
And society was very hierarchical.
Rigidly. Clothing was mostly wool for ordinary people, but the elite. They'd be draped in expensive imports, Egyptian linen, Indian cotton, and that incredibly prized Chinese silk.
And the family structure.
Centered around the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, who had considerable, almost absolute authority by law.
And their public works were just stunning. Londinium gets founded around 43 AD, and the Colosseum.
Built between 71 and 80 AD, mostly under Vespasian and Titus. A massive symbol of Flavian power, used for those huge public spectacles, often very violent ones, like gladiatorial combat.
Religiously, this century is also crucial. We see the very beginnings of Christianity.
And, importantly, its early persecution, especially under Nero after that fire in 64 AD. At the same time, you have the writing of foundational Christian texts, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and John. The Book of Revelation probably composed roughly between 66 and 99 AD.
And other religions were popular too.
Yeah, mystery cults like Mithraism were gaining traction, especially among soldiers.
The legacies from Rome in this era are undeniable. Latin is the root of Romance languages, our Western alphabet, the calendar.
And of course, Christianity starting its long, complex journey right here.
So for a core concept on society and culture.
Maybe imagine Rome as this giant, bustling city with these amazing public buildings showing off its power, like the Colosseum.
Okay.
But underneath that grandeur, society is like a layered cake with a huge gap between the rich top layer and the much larger bottom layer. And amongst the traditional gods and rituals, new ideas, especially Christianity, are starting to take root. Sometimes quietly, sometimes causing real trouble with the authorities.
That works. Now, the Roman economy, it sounds remarkably advanced for the time.
It really was. It functioned like this vast integrated system.
Built on specialization, you mentioned.
Exactly. Different provinces focused on what they did best. Grain poured in from Egypt and North Africa. Wine and olive oil came from Italy, Hispania, Spain, Greece.
And this had a huge trade network.
Massive. Especially maritime routes across the Mediterranean. Our sources actually give us some figures. Goods imported just from the Indian Ocean region might have been worth around 1,000 million sesterces annually.
Wow. And the taxes on that?
Generated maybe 250 million sesterces in tax revenue for the state each year. Huge numbers. And don't forget, they were also getting Chinese silk, though usually through intermediaries along the Silk Road.
And all of this depended heavily on infrastructure, and crucially, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
Absolutely critical. They built new cities, often on grid plans. They had those famous Roman roads linking everything. They used navigable rivers, even dug some canals.
And the peace meant.
Well, the Pax Romana wasn't perfect peace everywhere all the time, but it generally meant settlements could thrive based on economic logic, good land, resources, trade routes, not just because they were easy to defend. And crucially, the Roman Navy actively policed the Mediterranean, which drastically reduced piracy.
Which was vital for shipping bulk goods.
Incredibly vital. Moving stuff like grain or construction materials by sea was something like 60 times cheaper than hauling it over land. Secure sea lanes were the lifeblood of the economy.
Okay, so the analogy here. Rome is like a massive interconnected shopping mall.
Yeah, that works. The roads are the highways inside the mall. The rivers and sea routes are the superhighways connecting different malls. And the Pax Romana, that's like having really good security guards everywhere.
So shops, provinces can be located anywhere useful, and goods can travel safely between them.
Exactly, allowing the whole giant system to function and generate wealth.
Their approach to science and medicine seems very Roman.
It's very practical. They definitely built on Greek knowledge, no question. But the Roman focus was very much on practical applications, especially things like public health and military medicine.
We see that in figures like Aulus Cornelius Celsus.
Right. His work De Medicina survives, covering a huge range of medical topics. And Dioscurides, whose Tascia Metamedica was this foundational encyclopedia of medicinal plants used for centuries.
And rich households might have their own doctors.
Yes, many large households employed their own medical specialists, often educated Greeks.
In surgery, especially military surgery, saw advancements.
Significant ones, driven by battlefield necessity. They developed specialized instruments, scalpels, hooks, forceps. They understood the importance of boiling water for sterilizing instruments. They used painkillers like opium or scopolamine. They used acidic substances like vinegar on wounds to clean them.
But they knew their limits.
Yes, while skilled at things like setting bones, treating skin problems, or digestive issues, Roman doctors were very aware that injuries to vital organs were usually fatal.
But what really stands out is their focus on public health on a huge scale.
Absolutely. That's where they truly excelled. They had a clear understanding of hygiene, their aqueducts, engineering marvels bringing clean water into cities on a scale not seen again for centuries.
And sewage systems.
Incredibly advanced. The Cloaca Maxima in Rome is the famous example, but many cities had sophisticated systems, unequaled until maybe the late 17th century. And the public baths weren't just social centers. They promoted widespread personal hygiene for citizens and the military alike. It was a societal commitment to preventing illness through sanitation.
So, the core concept for their science and health.
Romans were master builders and super practical thinkers. Their doctors learned from the Greeks, but really focused on fixing real-world problems, especially keeping soldiers fit. And they fundamentally got that clean water, and dealing with sewage were vital for everyone's health. It was like building super ancient, but remarkably effective public plumbing and sanitation for millions.
Okay, finally for Rome, we have to mention the raw power of nature in this century.
Yes. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, just devastating.
Burying Pompeii and Herculaneum.
Completely. The volcano is only about 5 miles from Pompeii. Sources suggest there was a big earthquake beforehand, a warning sign, but it seems to have been largely ignored.
And then the eruption itself.
Unleashed this terrifying mix of volcanic debris, ash, pumice, and superheated pyroclastic flows. People died instantly, either suffocated by the ash or incinerated by the heat, and they were rapidly buried.
What makes it so archaeologically significant is the preservation.
Right. Exactly. Because they were buried so quickly under meters of this material, everything was preserved for over 1,500 years. Pompeii was rediscovered, really explored from the 18th century onwards, but fully excavated much later.
And it preserves so much detail.
Incredible detail. Buildings, objects, mosaics, frescoes, even the hollow spaces left by the victims' bodies. Archaeologists could pour plaster into these voids to create those haunting casts. Thousands died, but it left us this unparalleled snapshot, a time capsule of Roman life.
So the core concept.
Imagine a huge mountain near some Roman towns that just got incredibly angry one day. It exploded and buried two whole towns almost instantly under tons of ash and debris, almost like burying a toy town in wet cement.
Okay.
Because it happened so fast and so completely. Everything was frozen in time, preserved exactly as it was at that moment. It gives us this unique, almost eerie look into their daily lives.
Wow, okay. That gives us a really powerful picture of Rome in the first century.
Now,
Let's pivot halfway across the world, really, to the Han Dynasty in China, also facing some significant political shifts in this century.
they certainly were. This century marks a major transition. The period we call the Western Han effectively ends in 9 AD.
That's when Wang Mang takes over.
Exactly. He was a powerful official, actually related to the Imperial family through marriage, and he seized the throne, declaring his own Xin dynasty. His rise was kind of helped by a series of young emperors on the throne, which let power drift towards maternal relatives and officials like him.
And Wang Mang tried some pretty radical reforms. Land redistribution.
He did. He attempted major land reforms, but coupled with widespread flooding from the Yellow River, these policies caused massive peasant frustration and hardship.
Which led to rebellion.
Widespread rebellion, famously the Red Eyebrows. By 23 AD, they were a huge force. They ultimately sacked the capital, Chang, and Wang Mang was caught and beheaded.
And out of that chaos,
A descendant of the original Han imperial line, Lu Xiu, emerges. He had to fight both the rebels and other contenders, but eventually he won out and established the Eastern Han dynasty, significantly moving the capital east to Luoyang.
okay, so the core concept for this political shift.
Think of it like the original ruling family maybe had some weak leaders or young kids on the throne for a while.
Right.
So a really powerful advisor, who's also related to the family, Wang Mang, sees his chance and just takes over, declares himself the new king.
But his plans didn't work out.
No, he tried to change things too much, too fast, and combined with natural disasters, people got really angry. This leads to a massive fight, a civil war, and eventually someone from the original royal family, Lu Ji, comes back, wins the fight, and basically restores the family's rule, but starts a new chapter from a different city.
That makes sense, the restoration. But the Eastern Han had its own problems later on.
It did, particularly after Emperor Zhang died in 88 AD. For much of the next century, you have a succession of emperors who come to the throne as young boys.
Which means
The real power often lay with their mothers, the empresses dowager, and their families, and increasingly with the court eunuchs.
the eunuchs. They become very powerful.
Immensely influential because they had direct access to the young emperors in the inner palace. And the sources show these power struggles could get incredibly brutal, with eunuchs sometimes orchestrating plots or even massacres against powerful families to consolidate the emperor's authority and, of course, their own influence. This internal court dynamic becomes a recurring weakness for the Eastern Han.
Okay. Economically, what defined the Han Dynasty in this period?
Massive scale, significant state control, and growth.
The population grew a lot. Big cities.
Huge cities, Shenyang, the old capital, and Luoyang, the new one, were among the largest urban centers anywhere in the world at that time. Population growth was significant.
And the government played a big role in the economy.
A crucial role. They invested heavily in infrastructure roads, bridges essential for official business and administration, but obviously that helped commerce too. And importantly, the state maintained monopolies over vital industries like salt and iron production.
And they had advanced tech for that, like
Yeah.
drilling for salt.
Yeah, quite amazing tech. They developed methods for drilling deep boreholes, sometimes thousands of feet down, using bamboo tubes and cast iron drill bits to reach underground brine deposits. Then they'd heat the brine to extract the salt. It's like an early form of industrial resource extraction, foreshadowing modern drilling techniques.
And the backbone of the economy was the farmers.
Largely, yes. Peasant farmers provided the agricultural base and the bulk of tax revenue. But there was this persistent tension. Farmers often fell into debt to wealthy landowners, losing their land.
Did the government try to help them?
They did make attempts. There were reforms aimed at aiding poor farmers and trying to limit the power of these big landowners, but it was a constant struggle throughout the dynasty.
And foreign trade was key, especially silk.
Absolutely vital. Silk was the cornerstone. The Silk Road trade, moving Chinese silk westwards through Central Asia towards Persia, India, and eventually Rome, usually via intermediaries, was incredibly important economically and culturally.
And they traded with neighbors, too.
Yes, significant trade with groups like the Shanyu nomads to the north exchanging things like food, grain, and luxury goods for horses and furs. There was even a black market, apparently, with Han iron weapons being traded illegally to neighbors who wanted them.
Okay, core concept for the Han economy.
Hmm. Think of the Han government as kind of like a giant state-owned corporation that controlled the most essential businesses, salt and iron. And it also built and maintained all the major highways for official use and trade.
And the economy ran on.
It ran on the farmers, who paid the taxes. The government tried to keep them afloat, even while, sort of behind the scenes, wealthy private individuals were getting more and more economic power.
Got it. What about Han's society? It sounds very structured.
Oh, very. Often described in three main tiers. At the top, the emperor, the powerful empress dowager, especially if the emperor was young, and the top officials,
Middle.
the farmers and peasants, seen as the productive base of society.
And bottom.
Artisans, merchants who were often wealthy but perhaps less respected socially, and slaves.
And the emperor's power was absolute.
Theoretically, yes. But in practice, the Empress Dowager could wield enormous influence, as could powerful officials or later the eunuchs.
A key thing about the Han, compared to the dynasty before them, the Qin, was their emphasis on culture and learning. Okay.
Absolutely crucial difference. To get a good job in the Han bureaucracy, you couldn't just be connected. You generally needed to demonstrate mastery of classical texts and Confucian principles. They valued scholarship immensely.
And they were meticulous record keepers.
Incredibly meticulous. The title list compiled from the Imperial Library is essentially China's first national bibliography. It covered everything: math, medicine, military strategy, philosophy, religion, arts. And their music bureau, the Yufu, systematically documented music, instruments, folk songs, amazing cultural preservation.
And their art.
Technically superb and often very expressive. We see painted murals on tomb walls depicting historical scenes, myths, daily life. This period sees the first major stone tomb sculptures, like spirit path figures. Lifelike clay figurines placed in tombs are common. Bronze work reached new heights, often inlaid with gold and silver. Lacquerware was perfected, and of course, silk weaving was a massive industry and a key export.
And religiously, this century saw Buddhism arrive.
Yes, Buddhism begins to filter into China from India during the Eastern Han, likely coming along those trade routes.
Okay, core concept for Han society.
It's definitely layered, hierarchical, with the emperor at the very top. But despite the strict structure, they placed a huge value on learning, on keeping records, and on creating really beautiful, sophisticated art and music. And importantly, getting ahead in government meant you had to be educated, you had to know the classics. Brains mattered as much as birth, at least in theory.
That emphasis on learning and practicality leads us straight into their science and technology, which was just remarkable.
Truly remarkable, with innovations that had a profound and lasting global impact, the single biggest one. Probably paper.
Credited to Kai Lin, around 105 AD, right at the end of our century.
Yes, though it built on earlier, cruder forms, Kai Lun is credited with significantly improving the process, creating higher quality paper from readily available stuff like bamboo fibers, hemp, old rags, tree bark.
And this was a game changer.
Massive game changer. Before this, they wrote mainly on bamboo slips or wood, which were heavy and cumbersome or expensive silk. This new paper was relatively cheap, lightweight, portable. It didn't replace the old materials overnight, but it spread rapidly, eventually revolutionizing how information was recorded, stored, and shared across China and much later, the world.
You called it the ancient internet.
Kind of. For its time, it was this revolutionary technology for distributing ideas and knowledge much more widely and easily.
But their innovation didn't stop at paper.
Not at all. They developed early forms of suspension bridges. Designs with flat wooden roadways hung from cables were emerging by around 90 AD.
And the deep drilling for salt.
Incredible. Using derricks, cast iron drill bits, they could reach depths of nearly 5,000 feet to tap brine deposits. As we said, way ahead of its time, foreshadowing modern deep drilling for oil and gas.
The wheelbarrow, too.
The wheelbarrow seems to be a Chinese invention, possibly even earlier, maybe 100 BC, but certainly used in this era. The key was putting the wheel under the load, which uses leverage to make it much easier to carry heavy things. Simple, but brilliant.
And Zhang Heng's seismograph. That's just mind-blowing for the time.
It really is. Developed around 132 AD, so just after our century, but based on the knowledge of this era, it was this elaborate bronze vessel, dragons around the rim, frogs at the base, inside a pendulum mechanism.
And it could detect distant earthquakes.
Apparently, yes. When an earthquake occurred even hundreds of miles away, the tremor would cause the pendulum to swing in that direction. This triggered a mechanism that made a bronze ball drop from the mouth of the dragon facing the earthquake source into the mouth of the frog below. It made a noise, alerting observers and indicating the direction.
And it worked.
The historical records claim it successfully detected an earthquake some 400 miles away that wasn't even felt in the capital, Luoyang. It's basically the world's first remote earthquake detector. An incredible piece of engineering.
They also had advanced metalworking way back, blast furnaces for cast iron.
Yes, dating back centuries before this, and even tools resembling adjustable wrenches found from the 1st century BC, initially used for measurement.
And dictionaries?
Xu Shen compiled the first proper Chinese dictionary, Shuanjizi, organizing characters by radicals, tracing their evolution. A monumental work of scholarship.
So the Han were just phenomenal inventors.
Driven by practical needs, a sophisticated understanding of mechanics and materials, and this deep scholarly tradition. These weren't just small tweaks, they were foundational leaps in technology and knowledge.
Okay, let's travel again. South from China to India in the 1st century AD. The political scene here sounds quite different from Rome or Han China.
It is quite different. India in this period wasn't a single unified empire like the other two we've discussed. It was this vast subcontinent, characterized by a complex mix of regional powers and constantly shifting political entities.
New groups emerged.
Constantly. We see the rise of powers like the Western satraps, who were of Saka origin, starting around 35 AD in Western India.
And the Kushan Empire. That sounds important.
Very important. The Kushan Empire gets established by Kujala Kadphises around 68 AD. They originated in Central Asia and would eventually build this huge empire stretching from parts of Central Asia deep into North India, becoming a major bridge between cultures.
And other regional powers.
Yes. In the Deccan region, the Satavahana dynasty was significant. One of their emperors, Gautamiputra Satakarni, won a major victory over a Saka king around 79 AD, an event so important it's considered the start date for the Shalivahana era calendar used in parts of India for centuries.
So this fragmented landscape, was it partly due to invasions from the northwest?
That was definitely a factor. The mountain passes in the northwest were like a gateway for groups coming from Central Asia, Sakas, Kushans, Parthians at different times. These repeated incursions contributed to this dynamic mosaic of regional states, rather than one single dominant power controlling the whole subcontinent for long periods.
But despite all that political fragmentation,
There remained this strong underlying cultural identity across the subcontinent. Shared religious traditions, social structures, artistic styles. Even amidst political change, there was a distinct Indian civilization.
okay, so the core concept for India's politics.
Instead of one big kingdom like Rome or Han China, picture India as this huge landmass made up of lots of different kingdoms and territories. Some are growing, some shrinking, sometimes new groups arrive from the north and set up shop.
Not one ruler for everyone.
No, the political map was always changing. But, and this is key, even with all these different rulers, the people across the region shared a deep common culture, traditions, and ideas that connected them all.
Economically, though, India sounds like it was absolutely central to the whole ancient world system.
Totally central. They were pivotal intermediaries on the Silk Road, connecting the Roman world and the Chinese world.
And their own goods were highly sought after.
Hugely sought after. Indian cotton textiles were famous. Spices, pepper, cardamom, cinnamon were incredibly valuable. Precious stones like diamonds, pearls, sapphires. These were exported both west to Rome and east to China. Remember those Roman trade figures? A lot of that value originated in or passed through India. It was like the grand central station for both the land routes and the sea routes.
And they had major trade routes within India itself.
Oh yes, a complex network crisscrossed the subcontinent. The Uttarapatha, the Northern Road, was this major east-west superhighway. It ran for thousands of miles from Gandhara in the northwest, near modern Pakistan, Afghanistan, all the way across northern India to the port of Tamarlipta on the Bay of Bengal. It passed through key cities like Taxila, Lahore, Mathura, Varanasi.
And it connected outwards.
Yeah, a branch connected up to the main Silk Road routes through Central Asia. This is actually really important for how Buddhism spread north into China.
And north-south routes.
The Dakshinapatha, the southern road, ran from cities in the north down into the Deccan Plateau, connecting places like Shravasti to Pradesthana. And these routes then linked to major ports on the Arabian Sea, like Nalasopara or Paruch, which were hubs for maritime trade.
So sea trade was just as important as land trade for India.
Absolutely. India has this enormous coastline dotted with natural harbors and ancient ports. They had a very robust seafaring tradition. Indian merchants and sailors were key players in the maritime trade networks across the Indian Ocean, what's sometimes called the Maritime Spice Road connecting the Red Sea and Roman Egypt with East Africa, Southeast Asia, and even Han China.
And it wasn't just goods moving on these routes.
No way. It was ideas, technologies, religions, artistic styles. Everything flowed along these trade arteries, with India right in the middle of it all.
Socially, you mentioned the caste system.
Yes, Indian society was largely organized according to the complex hierarchical caste system, the Varna and Jati system, which determines social status, occupation, and rules about interaction, largely based on birth. It was already ancient by this period.
And the main religious traditions.
Hinduism, in its evolving forms, was the dominant tradition for most people. But Buddhism, which originated in India centuries earlier, was also very significant, particularly patronized by some rulers and merchants.
And this is when Buddhism really starts spreading outside India.
Yes, this period, especially with the Kushans facilitating connections, is key for Buddhism's transmission along trade routes into Central Asia and then into China. We have the earliest documented imperial sponsorship of Buddhism in China dated to 65 AD, right in our century.
And another interesting development from India around this time, sugar.
Yes, the first known production of crystalline sugar from sugarcane seems to have developed in northern India, probably around or shortly after the 1st century AD, a major innovation that would eventually sweeten the world.
Okay, core concept for Indian society and culture.
It's structured by this very ancient, deeply ingrained social system, the caste system. It's the birthplace of two massive world religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. And Buddhism in particular is starting to travel, like this powerful idea carried along the trade routes, especially towards China. Oh, and they figured out how to make sugar from sugarcane. Seems simple now, but a big deal then.
Now, let's get to India's contribution it literally shapes how we all think and calculate every single day.
Mathematics, absolutely. India made foundational contributions in this period, and arguably the most impactful for the entire world was the development of the decimal place value number system, the system we all use.
Including, crucially, the concept of zero.
Yes, the concept of zero, shunya, as not just nothing, but as a number in its own right, and critically, as a placeholder within the place value system. That was the stroke of genius.
Why was that so revolutionary?
Because it allowed any number, no matter how large or small, to be represented using just 10 symbols. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Before this, most number systems, like Roman numerals, were incredibly clumsy for large numbers or complex calculations. This Indian system made arithmetic and higher mathematics vastly more efficient and powerful.
And how was it received elsewhere initially?
It took time to spread. When Indian numerals, including 0, eventually reached the Middle East, and then Europe via Arab scholars centuries later, 0 was initially viewed with some suspicion, even wonder. But its practical power was undeniable, and it eventually replaced older systems.
So, the core concept here for Indian math.
India basically gave the world the operating system for numbers. Imagine trying to do serious math or even just write down large numbers easily without the number 0. It's like trying to type without a space bar or a 0 key, fundamentally limiting. India invented 0 as a number and integrated it into this brilliant place value system that we all learn in school. 10 simple symbols to write down any number imaginable. It was a truly genius idea that fundamentally changed how everyone, everywhere, eventually did math.
And they were working on other advanced concepts too.
Yes, early work on negative numbers, arithmetic operations, algebra. Indian mathematical works were often composed in Sanskrit, sometimes even in verse, using coded language for numbers. Texts like the Bakshali manuscript, although the surviving copy is later, likely reflect mathematical knowledge present in or developing during this era, showing things like algebraic equations being solved.
And this knowledge spread.
Yes, these mathematical ideas traveled along those same trade routes, primarily eastward and westward through interactions with Persian and Arab cultures initially. Combined with Greek geometry and West Asian algebraic traditions, they formed a crucial foundation for the later scientific revolution in Europe.
It's just incredible to see how these regions, Rome, China, India, which seem so distinct, were actually connected.
They absolutely weren't isolated worlds. The 1st century AD really shows us a world that was, in many ways, surprisingly interconnected. The Silk Road over land and the maritime routes across the Indian Ocean were the major arteries of this connection.
Goods flowing constantly.
Silk from China, heading west, Spices, cotton, gems from India heading both west to Rome and east to China. Roman goods like glassware, wool, maybe gold and silver heading east in return.
But it was much more than just stuff being traded.
Far more. It was the diffusion of culture, technology, religion. We saw Buddhism spreading from India to Central Asia and China along those very routes. Ideas traveled with the merchants, monks, and migrants.
So this period wasn't just about three separate empires existing side by side.
No, it was about the emergence of a kind of nascent global network. Ideas, technologies, philosophies, artistic styles, they didn't stop at political borders. Things moved.
Examples like,
Well, the eventual spread of Chinese paper-making technology westward, the transmission of India's revolutionary decimal number system and the concept of zero, the diffusion of religious beliefs like Buddhism and later Christianity moving west and east from the Roman world. These were all part of this complex global exchange that was really getting established in this century. It laid fundamental groundwork.
so bringing this deep dive towards a close, the 1st century AD really emerges as this foundational period across these major civilizations.
Absolutely. For Rome, we saw them navigating intense political instability, especially around succession, alongside continued military expansion, but also facing real limits and resistance. They maintained this massive empire with incredibly pragmatic public health systems, and they witnessed the terrifying sudden power of nature at Vesuvius.
Han China endured its own dynastic turmoil, but saw the restoration of Han rule. They maintained a centralized state with significant control over key industries, fostered this flourishing culture that deeply valued learning and art, and of course gave the world these groundbreaking practical inventions like paper and the seismograph.
And India, though politically more of a mosaic of shifting kingdoms, was absolutely central to global trade, the hub connecting east and west by land and sea. It maintained a strong, shared cultural identity despite the political fragmentation, and made those revolutionary contributions to mathematics that would eventually reshape global thought.
And the crucial takeaway, maybe, is the interconnectedness. These three worlds were increasingly linked.
Exactly. Those trade routes, the Silk Road, the sea lanes, they weren't just about making money. They were the highways for the flow of ideas, technologies, religions, culture, creating connections that would only deepen over the following centuries. The events and developments of this specific century, 1 to 100 AD, really set the trajectories for these civilizations and laid essential groundwork for, well, the entire future of human history in many ways.
It really makes you reflect, doesn't it, on how deeply the past connects to our present. Why should you, listening now, care about a century 2,000 years ago?
Because the political challenges they wrestled with, like how to ensure stable leadership, are still relevant. The vast trade networks they built are the ancestors of our global economy. The incredible technologies they invented, like paper,
And the fundamental mathematical concepts they developed, like zero and the decimal system from India.
they still directly influence your life every single day. The calendar on your wall has Roman roots. The numbers on your phone screen rely entirely on that system from India. The very ability to easily write down and share complex information owes a massive debt to paper from China.
Looking at this period across different cultures at the same time, it just helps you see that bigger picture, doesn't it? How interconnected human history has always been, even in ancient times.
So maybe here's a final thought for you to take away. Think about how something as abstract as a mathematical concept like zero, or a seemingly simple invention like paper, developed in one specific part of the world 2,000 years ago. How could that quietly, almost invisibly, but profoundly reshape the daily lives, the capabilities, the very possibilities for billions of people across the entire globe over the next 2 millennia?
And what seemingly small or niche innovations or ideas happening somewhere in the world today might have that kind of massive, silent, long-term impact 2,000 years from now.
Something to ponder.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating 1st century AD.